If you have your Bibles, please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There's a business leadership expert named Jim Collins, and he wrote a book, How the Mighty Fall. And in the preface, Collins shared a very personal story as a metaphor, which he related to businesses that are in trouble. And when I read it, I immediately thought of the context of marriage and how marriages can be in trouble. And Collins said that one day in August of 2002, he and his wife Joanne went out on this long uphill run to Electric Pass, which is just outside of Aspen, Colorado. And it starts out at about the altitude of 9,800 feet, and it ends just before 13,000 feet. So in a 4.6 mile stretch, they're climbing 3,200 feet. And at about the 11,000 feet mark, Collins said that he gave in to the thin air, and he just ran out of breath and had to slow down to a walk, as you can imagine. But his wife, Joanne, kept running. And Jim said that when he emerged from the tree line, where the air is getting really thin, he spotted his wife way ahead of him, and she was wearing this bright red sweatshirt, and she was running from switchback to switchback and just looked like the picture of health. And he said she was a picture of good health, vibrant and strong. But 2 months later, Joanne received the diagnosis that led to 2 mastectomies. And looking back, Jim said, I realized that while I'm watching my very healthy wife looking so healthy, that she probably was very sick, and we just didn't know it. And he compared that to businesses. And I thought of marriage, that sometimes marriages can look very healthy and very good to many people on the outside, but there could be something below the surface that is making that marriage very sick. And it's like a cancer eating away at, and not many people even notice it. The friends and family, and church members, they see people at church, they don't realize that something's really wrong here. And sometimes couples don't even realize it until it's almost too late. And there are times when you can know a marriage is in trouble, though, just by listening to the things people say. One lady was speaking to a women's club. She met with this group of ladies in this big room, and she was speaking about, her topic was marriage. And so she asked all the ladies, she said, how many of you ladies would like to mother your husbands? Kind of sarcastically. Well, one lady near the back row raised her hand. And the speaker said, you actually want to mother your husband? And she said, the lady said, mother, I thought you said smother. So I'm sorry. When one man was asked how he gets along with his in-laws, he said, actually, I get along with my mother-in-law very, very well. We have a lot in common. Both of us think my wife should have married someone else. I'd be careful where you say that. Yeah, but you've probably heard the statistics that 50% of all marriages in America end in divorce. And then people say that it's even true of Christian marriages, that 1 out of every 2 Christian marriages ends in divorce. And, I heard that for the longest time, and then I got to thinking, that can't be right. Because, in the church that I grew up in, and in the churches where I served, it wasn't 1 out of every 2 marriages that were failing. Something's wrong with that statistic. And so as it turned out, that idea that 1 of every 2 Christian marriages was failing wasn't actually true. Part of the reason for that is how they defined Christian marriage. And actually, the numbers of divorces in America it's on the decline. Christian author Sean T. Feldhahn revealed some interesting statistics in her book from 10 years ago called The Good News About Marriage. And according to the Census Bureau, 72% of those who have ever been married are still married to the same person. And of the 28% that are not, some of that 28% included those who had died. And so the divorce rate among Americans is lower than what was said. And the divorce rate among churchgoers is 27% lower than what it is in the world. By that, they meant Christian marriages, meaning those who attend church regularly together. And Feldhahn also said that 93% of married people said that they would marry the same person if they had to do it again. Remember from last week that I said we're in the second half of the book. We've been going through 1 Corinthians. And we're in chapter 7, verses 17 to 40. We're in a long section. But last week I mentioned that this marked the second half of the book. And we know that because of a particular marker that he gave to us. He had been dealing with disunity in the first 6 chapters of the book because he got some information from the household of a woman named Chloe. And so he dealt with those issues of disunity. And now in chapter 7, he starts to answer their questions. They entered into a Q&A. And I told you about a marker that he uses to know when we're moving to a different topic that they had asked him about in a letter they wrote to him. And it's marked by the words, now concerning. And in this passage, we saw it in chapter 7, verse 1, but we'll see it again today in chapter 7, verse 25. But all of chapter 7 had to do with questions about marriage. And today we're going to be covering this long section, but there's this long thread that goes throughout this long section of verses, from verses 17 to 40. I know it's a big section, but there's a thread that goes through it. And I think what he's saying is this, that we should make serving the Lord our top priority wherever he has us. Wherever God has us, that is to be our top priority, which is serving the Lord. In this chapter about marriage, Paul makes it very clear that God wants us to stay where God has put us until he puts us somewhere else. And we stay there and we serve him, and that is what he wants us to focus on more than anything else, is that we focus on serving him wherever we are. First of all, he says, bloom where God has planted you. We're going to be going through verses 17 to 24 in a minute. But as I understand it in auto racing, for example, the Indianapolis 500, when there is some problem on the track that's going to endanger the other drivers, they wave a yellow flag. And the yellow flag is to give a signal to the drivers, not for them to stop, but to hold their positions as they go around the track. They aren't to lose any ground. They're not to gain any ground. And in these verses, Paul saw this situation at the church of Corinth, and he saw the need to wave a yellow flag. And he said, I want you to hold your positions. Maintain your place in life at this point. And they should remain in their situations and bloom where they're planted. And notice, in this passage, it's kind of cool. And look at verse 17, first of all. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. It's so easy to see that this is his main point here, to bloom where you're planted, because he brings it up again in verse 20. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Verse 24, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. So he's saying bloom where you're planted. Keep where you're at, and you focus on serving the Lord. That's his main point. His main point is serving the Lord wherever you are. And in these verses, he's saying bloom where you're planted. And in between those verses, in between verses 17, 20, and 24, he gives illustrations of how they're to fulfill this. In verses 18 and 19, he says they don't need to change their ethnicity. In verses 21 to 23, the second illustration is that they don't need to change their economic position. Both illustrations are meant to teach them that they're never disqualified from serving the Lord where they are. The first illustration is in verses 18 and 19, and it's about ethnicity. And he used the issue of circumcision. I wish that he hadn't. But man, Paul never seemed to shy away from subjects. He just puts it out there. Look at verses 18 and 19. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Then in verse 19, for neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Paul used this illustration of circumcision to tell them that they don't need to change their ethnicity to become a Christian, that they don't have to become Jewish to be part of God's people. In the Old Covenant, yeah, they did, but not now. He was saying, were you a Jew when God saved you? Go ahead and continue serving Jesus in your Jewishness. Were you a Gentile when God saved you? Then go ahead and continue serving him as a Gentile. You don't need to change your ethnicity to serve him. And he said, if you were circumcised when you were saved, don't think you have to undo that. I have no idea how that would work, and I don't want to know how you would undo it. I mean, Paul. And to the Gentiles, he said, don't you guys worry about getting circumcised. That's what he tells the Gentiles. Don't worry about getting circumcised. And the guys who probably already went through it, so now's a fine time to tell me. Thank you, you were here a year and a half, and now you decide to tell me this. That would have been real useful information back when you were here. Thank you, Paul. So he said to focus on obeying the commands. Now, circumcision was a command, but it wasn't a moral command that applies to us today who are now under the new covenant. It was not re-upped in the new covenant. If we were still under the old covenant, Paul could not have told them, don't seek circumcision. That's evidence that we're under the new covenant and not under the old, because he would have just said, sure, you've got to be circumcised. But he told them not to worry about it. Paul then returned to his point in verse 20, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Then comes the second illustration. It's about economic status. Look at verses 21 to 23. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he was called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. And then he repeats his main point. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. So, those who are Christians who are bondservants, they had the opportunity in that culture to earn money and by doing odd jobs. And what they would do is they would take that money that they earned and they would take it to some temple and present that money to the god as a sacrifice of that temple, and they would set it aside for them. And then when they had saved up enough money, they could take their master to that temple, and then the money would be given to that master, and the bondservant would then be free if they wanted to do that. And so Paul was told the bondservants in verse 21, hey, if you can gain your freedom, go ahead and do it. You see, even though our economic status doesn't affect whether we can serve the Lord or not, if we can improve our economic status, it's fine. Do it. Go ahead and get a better job. Do better financially. There's nothing wrong with that, Paul's saying. But as Christians and churches, we need to get this message that anybody, regardless of their ethnicity and regardless of their economic status, the ground is level at the foot of the cross, as the old saying goes. And Paul was saying, bloom where you're planted. Secondly, keep the big picture in mind. Keep the big picture in mind. We're going to be going through verses 25 and the first part of verse 29. This is a great section because Paul answers the question, what should I do when God's will has options? You know, there's sometimes God's will is no mistaking it because his will is given to us in commands. He gives us a command, well, we're to obey it. And so that sometimes it's very clear. But there are other times where there's no clear command from God in this, and we have to make a choice of, what's the better judgment in this situation. And there's no clear command, so it's a judgment call. Should I get married? Who should I marry? When should I marry? What job should I take? Where should we live? You know, my wife, Cindy, is here today. And by the way, I have Cindy down here. And our oldest daughter, Megan, is right over here. And our grandson, Thaddeus, is here for his birthday. But they came to visit this weekend. And I have some wonderful stories about Megan to tell some of you if you care to. No, she's a delight. I told you Bethany was a baby princess. Megan calls herself, then that makes me queen because she's the oldest daughter. But your mom's a queen, don't forget it. I don't either. When Cindy and I were in the summer of, no, it was in the fall of 1986, I was 25 years old. And I was living in Belleville, Illinois as a youth minister there. And my friend Al came to visit me. He came down to visit me, so we were going to go watch the Chicago Cubs play against the St. Louis Cardinals at Busch Stadium. And so he came down. We went to the game, came back, church the next day. And so I was sleeping on my bed. He was sleeping on the couch in the living room. And I yelled into him. You see, I was getting ready. In December, I was going to ask Cindy to marry me. And so I yelled to him. I said, hey, before you go to sleep, I want you to pray that when I ask Cindy to marry me, that she says yes. And I said, and don't pray any of this if it be your will stuff. I want it to happen. He said, oh, all right. I couldn't take a chance. So I don't, normally, I encourage people that we should pray what Jesus prayed. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. In this case, I thought, what if? So I told him, don't pray that way. Just pray that she'll say yes, even if she shouldn't. That's not advisable, but in that case, it worked out great, so I'm so thankful. But in verse 25, Paul said, now concerning the betrothed. Here is one of the markers that I told you about, because remember I told you there's the markers of now concerning. Well, chapter 7, verse 1 was one. Now in verse 25 is another one of those markers. They had asked him some more questions about marriage. And they were asking about the betrothed, or those who were engaged. And Paul is answering this question about marriage, and they had apparently asked about engaged girls because this Greek word for betrothed means virgins, and it has a feminine ending. So I think he's talking to the unmarried, those who are contemplating getting married. And Paul says, for you engaged people, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he says in verse 25, I have no command from the Lord. He's meaning that Jesus didn't speak to this issue, so I don't have a command to appeal to that Jesus had spoken to about this issue. But as one who's been blessed with having this trustworthy authority as an apostle, I'll tell you what I believe about this. And so he's saying that it is trustworthy and it's from the Lord. Okay, so what did Paul tell the betrothed or the engaged about making a judgment call about whether or not to get married? And he said to base it on God's timing. Base it on God's timing. Take a look at things. Pray to wisdom for God's timing on things. Look at verse 26 through 28. He said, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles. And I would spare you that. So in verse 26, he says, in view of the present distress. So you see, we can translate it okay. In view of the present distress. That's what those words mean. What he meant by the present distress, we have to guess. You see, I think Paul and those who were receiving this letter in Corinth initially, I think they were on a certain wavelength that we're not clued into exactly. And so we have to just do our best job of guessing what he meant by this present distress. And look at the first part of verse 29. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. So there's this phrase, appointed time. Now that does kind of sound like end times talk to me. It sounds that way. And so my guess is, based on the insights I've received just from guys who are really great thinkers like Gordon Fee and C.K. Barrett and some others, this reference is to one of two possibilities. I think he is talking about the expected return of Jesus, or, because it does sound like end times language, sort of, and then also increased persecution. And this did happen shortly after this letter was written. There was persecution of Christians, and it really intensified. And it might be that Paul was saying, as he's been traveling around, he might have been thinking he's really sensing an increase in the persecution of Christians, and he sees this as it's going to get worse. And he might be saying in this case, it could be better that you remain single if you're single right now. If you're single, you won't potentially end up grieving if your spouse is killed for their faith in Jesus. Or if you're single, you might be better off staying single because you might not have to face, if this intensification of persecution continues like it is, you may end up having to face having your children taken away from you. And he said, so you might want to hold off on that. And that did happen. Kids were ripped out of their parents' arms for their faith in Jesus. And as we look at our world today, do you get the sense that persecution against Christians is being ratcheted up a little bit? I see it. I'm seeing it more and more. Christians and pastors are being sued for hate speech when they take a stand on biblical truth. And I'm not being paranoid or misinterpreting things. It's happening more and more. It's really happened in Canada, and we're often not too far behind them. But it's simply the reality of what's been happening on an increasing level in recent years, where it's kind of open season. It's okay to make fun of Christians in our world and in our culture. But I think Paul was telling them to live with the big picture in mind. How can you make the most impact for God's kingdom? And the big picture is that God can use you regardless of your ethnicity or regardless of your economic level. Those things may matter in some places in the world, but they don't matter in God's kingdom. And thirdly, being married and being single have advantages and disadvantages. Look at verses 29 to 40. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to serve in order to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. That's what his main point is. He wants to secure our undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever's firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. When Paul said these things, he was using hyperbole or exaggeration. And the point he was trying to make was to get them to remember that in serving God in his kingdom is to be our highest priority wherever we're at. And of course, he didn't mean literally that you ignore your wife or your husband, or you ignore paying your bills, because that's dealing with the world, or that you ignore your grief or your joy. He was saying those things are there. But no matter what situation you're in there is something that is vastly more important, and that is serving the kingdom of God. Don't get caught up in those things to where you lose sight of serving God and his kingdom. And the whole thrust of this passage is that marriage is a gift and singleness is a gift. Marriage is an option, and some should think about that, and being single is an option, and some should be thinking about that. And both the married and the single should affirm each other in the church, the body of Christ. And he was saying in verses 32 to 35 that no matter which one you choose, whether to remain single or to get married, there are going to be some problems. There are going to be some advantages, but there are also going to be some disadvantage to either path that you choose. He just saying, I want you to go in with both eyes open. And, he says those who are married deal with having to look after the needs of their spouse. Those who are single don't have those issues to face. And, they're also, that can be an advantage, but there can be disadvantages too. He says, so either one you choose, there's going to be advantage or disadvantage, but just go in with both eyes open. In the summer of 1989, Cindy and I had been married for 2 years. And she went with me to my 10-year class reunion. And we sat at a table with about three or four other couples who were from the church that we were attending at the time. And in those couples, at least one of them had graduated with me, so that's why they were at that reunion. So we sat at the table with them. And my class asked me to have the prayer before they opened up the bar. And I said, you sure you don't want me to wait till mealtime? And they said, no, we want you to pray before we open up the bar. I said, would you like me to pray, Lord, forgive some of these people for what they are about to do? And so anyway, after the prayer, they opened the bar, and then we got our food and we ate. Well, I got up and left Cindy at the table and walked around to reminisce with some old friends. And I left her there. I was gone about an hour as I walked around talking to people. And, I went to different tables, saw different friends, and said, hey, man, the music's too loud in here. Let's just go in another room so we can catch up on what's been going on the past 10 years. And some of them did, but others, the guys who were married, every one of them said, no, I better stay here with my wife. And I remember thinking, how pitiful. These guys have let their wives put a leash on them. And I thought, I'm so thankful to God that I don't have a wife who's henpecking me and making it so I can't spend a few minutes and have some freedom to catch up with some old friends I haven't seen in 10 years. And I thanked God that Cindy wasn't so needy like the wives of my friends. On the way home, I commented about some of these conversations I had with guys, and she wasn't talking in response. And so I looked over at her, and she had tears coming down both of her cheeks and wiping them away. And I said, is something wrong? See, as a professional minister, you pick up on body language like that. So learn these things. And she said, you really hurt my feelings tonight. I said, how? And she said, I felt like you were embarrassed of me or something. You didn't want to take me around to introduce me to your friends. And she said, I sat at at the table with these other couples, and the husbands were staying with their wives, or they got up to take them dance, and they went around with me, and it just hurt. I felt like such a schmuck. And I could not apologize enough. And so I'll tell you what, at the 20-year and 30-year, 40-year reunion, I did not leave her side. I went into the restroom with her. I was like, I was not leaving her. I just felt so horrible about that. But I was learning. I'm not alone anymore. I'm one flesh with this precious woman that God gave me, and I better remember that. That part of making God my top priority involves making her needs my top priority too. Paul was saying, hey, if you want my opinion, being single would be a better option given all that's going on right now. But if you can't handle that and you choose to get married, that's fine too. He's saying, take your pick, but just go in, whatever you decide, with both eyes open and recognize the potential problems as well as the advantages, the pros and cons. And so he was kind of siding with those who had chosen not to get married, but for different reasons than some of them were choosing it. And it wasn't because marriage was a sin. It had to do with how you'd better be able to serve God's kingdom in some cases. And he knew that for most people, marriage was the better option. And he said, that's fine, get married. And he says, but marry in the faith. And he was saying, don't you dare leave your wife by yourself at the table. He was also saying that if you're able to handle being single, that's great too. But once you're married, stay married. And then in verse 35, he said he was writing this to secure their undivided attention to the Lord. And in verses 39 and 40, he spoke to widows and widowers, and he was saying that they're free to remarry as long as they marry someone who's a Christian. But he said in his judgment, if they're able to live out their years single and focus on serving the Lord, that would be great. That would be almost preferable. But if they choose to marry, that's fine too. Listen, God put you and me where he wants to. He put you where he wants to use you, and use you where he put you. I'm trying to say that right. God put you where he put you to use you where he put you. That's what I'm trying to say. And quit demanding that God put you somewhere else. He put you there to use you there in that situation. Or he allowed you into that. If he didn't put you there, he allowed you into that situation. He wants to use you in that situation right where you're at. So that's why the overall point of all this is let's make serving the Lord our top priority wherever he has us. Would you stand, please? We're going to sing a song of invitation. And if you have not given your life to Jesus, and God has been working in your life in some way, maybe through this service, but more likely through just different situations in your life. And possibly, maybe today he did seal the deal in your mind, and you want to give your life to Jesus and begin a relationship with him. We would invite you to come and say that. He said, if you confess me before men, I'll confess you before my Father in heaven. And we'd love to talk with you about how you can begin a right relationship with him, where to start, what to do. And so we offer this invitation for that, but also for those who want to rededicate their lives. Maybe you've already given your life to him, but you need to recommit to him, and that would be fine too. And we have people who'd be glad to pray with you about anything. Or maybe you're an immersed believer in Christ, but you have not yet placed your membership at a church and chosen to serve the Lord with a congregation. We would invite you to do that today. Just come forward and let me know, and we'll take your confession of faith and welcome you as a member of this church. And so we invite you, whatever your decision is, to make it while we sing this song.